Yeah, no, and I've definitely gone through a lot of that kind of in the
Mm.
last year or so after an injury, season-ending injury last year, and
Oh, yeah.
just figuring out like why am I doing this anymore?
Yeah.
What do I want to do? What how do I enjoy life? Because I like you, I started when I was 12.
Yeah.
You've got a few more years on me, but kind of similar
Yeah.
starting time frame, and it's just like
Yeah. So,
you work so hard for so long, and then you're like, okay. And it's your focus. Like that, it's been my whole world for almost 20 years,
yeah.
and it brought me a lot of enjoyment. But then you're like, it diminishes, and you have to figure out, okay, well, what do I enjoy now? And it's
Yeah.
tough. At least for me, it's been tough, just because
Yeah.
all the other hobbies and activities have fallen by the wayside to make room for the focus. And then when
Yeah.
it's kind of fallen out of the limelight, you're like, oh, there's this big void to kind of figure out what to do
Yeah.
now.
And that's a very tough thing, I think, for a lot of people who've competed. When that day comes that they end the competition, it's like, what next? And you suddenly have all these hours free in the day, you
Yeah.
know, and you don't have to worry about what you've just eaten. It's well, for health you should, but of course, like for your athletic performance, it doesn't matter anymore. So
Yeah.
and that's difficult. And I think one of the other what's the word? Not concern, but one of the other issues is that there's nothing to help people understand how to overcome that. There's no
Yeah.
guidance. But and this is there are good examples right at the top Olympic end where people end their career and they don't know what to do. They're like,
Hmm.
well, what now? Do I go into politics? Do I go into coaching? Do I,
Hmm.
what? So yeah. So
That's why
it's
as we're talking about it, I'm like, I should find a bunch of former professional athletes and figure out what everybody did. Like, just start
what
talking
they
to
do. Yeah.
just start talking to professional athletes about it. I don't know what for. I don't know what reason I would do it besides curiosity.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely because everybody takes a different journey. I know there are plenty of people that go on to coach because it's like obviously you've got the time and experience and all the in-depth knowledge of the sport. And then there are some people that are like, all right, I'm going to go work an office job that has
Yeah.
nothing to do with so it's the kind of varied ways people take life after sport. I think
Mm.
might be interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about your research. You are, at least so far, the most prolific research author I've spoken to. So
Okay.
I want, like I said, at least so far. Um, so first I want to know, how do you come up with so many topics? As I was looking through like the research database with all of this stuff you have your name on, and there was sometimes three, four, I think even sometimes five, maybe more. I didn't go through every year you published, but I mean a lot of studies that came out you know
Mhm.
for you a year. How do you come up with so many topics and set up all of those studies to come out in a single year?
Yeah, good question. I've never been asked that actually, but it's a very practical question. So the I guess the way the development of ideas works is when you start off in that career path, you're generally being supervised by somebody else, and the research projects you're working on are often the brainchild of that person. So the hypothesis you'll be testing will be whatever they've been working on for years, and so on.
Hmm.
Um, when I finished my PhD in the UK and moved to the US to do a postdoc in Cleveland, a little bit of good fortune. I went there at a time where the supervisor I had was very well funded. He had a pretty big group, and there was a kind of small collection of good postdocs around me. And we worked together tremendously well and, like, yeah, discussed ideas all day, every day, and did a lot of
Hmm.
work and so on. And a little bit of good fortune, and that kind of helped me embed myself in that career and kind of grow from there. So at that time, the ideas were actually coming from the supervisor that we had, but
Okay.
he was pretty good at helping you nurture your own development. And so that was one thing I was very thankful for there, was being allowed to have some independence and start to nurture your own ideas. Um, so when I left there, I moved to Denmark. I lived in Denmark for about 6 years, and progressed up to become an associate professor there. So at that point, you've gone through like a transition from being somebody else's worker working on their ideas, transitioning through this phase of becoming a little more independent to a point where you're entirely independent and quite autonomous, and you're bringing in your own grants, you're paying your postdoc salaries and so on. And at that point, then you're that person. So, your students and postdocs are now working on ideas that you've had, and there's a bit of mutual, of course, discussion, and some people have their own independent projects. But for me, it was always like looking at the direction. So what is it I'm trying to look at? And so there's a continual theme throughout my publications that's kind of gearing towards trying to understand how physical activity and exercise can be used to either prevent or treat various components of diabetes. So whether it's looking at blood glucose control, or whether it's looking at blood lipids, or whether it's looking at ways of optimizing how to use activity in these patients. And so there was a kind of continual theme towards that. And where I eventually ended up, and I suppose in the last sort of 5 years of the career, was I started getting less interested in, I said this earlier actually, but the less interested in like the means of the population and more interested in the individual. And that's kind of where the overlap with coaching comes from, because you're then looking at, how does one individual person respond to this, and why do they respond in that way? And that was really where I ended up, I guess, leaving the career path. Was at that point where, that was my interest, and I'd done some work in that area, and I probably could have kept going, but I felt I needed a change. So everything was generated towards that goal, and now there are, of course, there are groups that will continue doing that type of work, and managing the experiments. It's that can be challenging because you need people. So you need to employ good students, good postdocs to be able to carry out the projects. And I suppose one of the issues in science is not everything comes to fruition, and so you can have projects that may be good ideas, but you just can't get them off the ground because you don't have funding, or you don't have the people to work on it. So it's a little bit of strategic planning to get things completed.
So what you're talking about, focusing on like a single individual and not so concerned about the mean. At that point, were you doing like case study type work, or?
No, not so much. So those interests essentially came out of looking at, if we, just give an example to kind of set the scene. If we have a group of patients that have undergone a particular treatment, and it doesn't matter what the treatment is, and we look at the entire group of patients, and this particular measurement has increased following the treatment. That looks brilliant, and you can run some stats and you can show that it's significant and so on, and that's nice. But when you look within that sort of average value, there's often patients who do not respond, or they respond ridiculously well.
And work 80-20.
Exactly, yeah. And so when you work with people, you talk to them, and when we're talking about exercise, which is generally a health promoting thing, there were a number of cases where our research participants and patients in the hospitals had undergone like long-term interventions, and they'd invested all this time and effort in coming to the lab and training and getting sweaty and giving up part of their day. And then at the end of it, nothing has changed. And on a personal level, they find that quite hard to deal with. They're like, why haven't things improved? And that was kind of where my interest came about there, is actually ignoring the scientific approach and actually thinking, actually, these are people, and they're not so happy when things don't improve. So is this real, or is it just anecdote? And so when I looked into that a bit more, there were more than just random coincidences. There are a number of people that have this same kind of outcome, where they're not necessarily getting more diseased, but they're just not improving. And so we were trying to identify what factors could be responsible for that. And then, if I bring the parallel to coaching again, we do the same thing all the time. You have, an athlete that doesn't seem to be responding to a particular strength training regimen or a particular speed workout or set of speed workouts. Why is it? Are they malnourished? Are they not sleeping? Are they, is there stress, psychological stress? Are there like family events going on? And then if all of those things are normal, then you look at the training. Is the
Mhm.
exercise wrong? And so there's, it's kind of fun. It's very analytical, but it's you can kind of chip away at it. And yeah, so a kind of a random parallel between academic research in diabetic patients and athletic performance, but it's essentially quite similar.
Yeah, but I mean that's a I guess novel and kind of neat way to look at the research though, and I guess it makes sense too in both directions, both in terms of say like a patient that doesn't respond to treatment, and then somebody who like hyper responds to treatment. Like, what are
Yeah.
their factors? Could you somehow like for you the non-responder, like could you somehow gather a group of non-responders and then try a new set and then see,
Hmm.
how do they respond to this new entirely different stimulus,
Yeah.
like, and then again, and you could, I know sample size is a big issue when it comes to academic studies, as I talk to everybody, is like getting enough people to participate. But
Yeah.
at least in my head, because I come from a math background, so I'm like, just turn the numbers through. I'm
Yeah.
like, you could do that like for an infinite number of variations
Yeah.
theoretically, where it's
Yeah.
like, all right, new set. We took all the non-responders, we put them in a new set. Now we have a new set of non-responders, and we like go
Bootstrap
down
the
and
numbers.
you're right. You just keep going down until you've like resolved everything and you've figured out like, okay, if you fit this criteria, you should be doing this kind of treatment and this. Anyway,
Yeah.
it just gets my head spinning about a different way you could try to figure out how to help people, which is kind of
Yeah.
like, I mean, really what we both do in different ways is like looking at the individual, like how can I help and affect this person?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I mean, you've hit that on the head there, is that if you have somebody that has not responded to one particular approach, it doesn't mean that they will never respond to something else.
Right.
And so when you take that collective of people who haven't necessarily benefited from whatever it is they've done, what is it that we can do to optimize the approach? And
Mhm.
that would be a good use of everyone's time. And yeah, so.
Do you have like, I'll say like a favorite piece of research, or do you feel like you have a lot of research, so maybe it's hard to pick out. Do you feel like there's anything that was like the most important piece that you did or worked on?
Um, yeah, I think one of the it started in Denmark. There was a line of work where we noticed that if we take a diabetic patient, we noticed one observation that the patients who had very poorly controlled blood glucose levels um, tended to respond a little less to an exercise training stimulus. And so that observation, it was a very small observation, but for me personally, that kind of led to a development of ideas that set the scene for me until I
Mhm.
left the career path in December just last year. So that particular period of time, which I think was 2012, was quite a nice year to make these observations, because it kind of mapped out the next 7 years.
Mhm.
So, and that's a very personal feeling. But and perhaps probably that it certainly wasn't the piece of work that gained the most like citations or the most like notoriety. It was just a personal like, oh, I was pleased with that. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, if that particular, time, that period, that one piece sparks a whole slew of things, then it's like,
mm,
even if it's a, personal satisfaction, it's still, I would say that's I'll call it a high performing piece of research just because it sets the scene for all the other
yeah.
things you end up doing.
Yeah, that's right. It opens different doors, and yeah, and also I think no matter what you do in life, no matter what your job is, you need sort of new developments, and you need kind of refreshment every so
Mhm.
often. And that was one of those moments in my career at that time, was like, oh, this is something refreshing, and this is, you could see it kind of like all the sparks going off here. So that's quite nice, and
Yeah, whereas like the work becomes energizing rather than like
yeah. Mhm.
draining to have to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's so. Yeah.
So one of the things I notice, I'm sure you see this not maybe not all the time, but from time to time you'll see like I'll say a pop publisher or blog style publisher like online. They'll quote research and then they'll give it a headline that has nothing to do with the research, or it'll be like really overblown. And you're like, that's not quite what the study was saying, or maybe the
Yes.
study's faulty. So I want your opinion on, so as a layman or for other laymen, if we're looking at scholarly research or looking at these articles and then trying to verify with the research, are there any immediate red flags to look for when you're like this isn't very good science? Like, is there anything you would see that would pop out?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I know what you're talking about because there's a lot of sort of mass media that translates science, or translates probably the wrong word, but
Tries to
tries to
translate.
decipher science. Um, and I guess as a scientist, it can be frustrating. And I suppose also I've had personal examples where I've been involved with journalists and articles that have been written. And when you read the final article, there are some clever ways that your conversation has been like turned into a discussion with other scientists when that never took place. And that's a little frustrating. But that said, I love that those people exist because we're very bad as scientists generally at getting the public message out, and we need the
Right.
people that can translate. And so, yeah, so when you're reading these stories, yeah, are there red flags you can look for? I think the first thing that stands out to me is when there's um, a what do you call it, like a journalist's article, that they will mention an author or a study, but there's no ability to click a link to go to the actual study, so you can't
Okay.
find the original source.
Yeah.
And a lot of, I find anyway, a lot of journalists are quite bad at that. Even some leading news outlets.
Hmm.
Um, People that are quite good at it. Alex Hutchinson is very good at it. I like his approach, his style he takes. I think he now writes for Outside magazine, but he has a sweat science kind of blog article post outlet. And he's very good actually at evaluating the science and then also providing links to the original source. And so you can get involved with that. The
Hmm.
difficulty is not everyone has you know, the education, I suppose, to be able to then interpret the original data.
Right.
There's a difference between just reading the abstract and reading the paper and understanding the nuances. So you put your trust right in the journalism,
Hmm.
and it's difficult to do. But I would say that's probably one of the key red flags is, what's the source and can you access it?
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
That's just it's something I struggle with, and part of the reason I like having people like you on the podcast, or really why the podcast is focused on people like you, is
Mm.
that I feel like we need more go between people doing the research and the rest of society who can hopefully can benefit from the research.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
because I mean, and I didn't do a master's or doctoral, but I did do some research for my degree for undergrad. So
Yes.
I come from a background where I'm at least moderately familiar with reading research
Yeah.
papers, and even sometimes I'm like, wait, what's happening? Just the way that
Yeah.
they're like the kind of standardization of how they need to be written
Yeah.
is not it's not common language, so it
No.
can be very confusing sometimes, especially when you haven't like been in that environment in quite some time, let
Yeah.
alone not familiar with it at all. So it's like
Yes. Yeah.
I wish there was some way we could like how you can go on Google Translate, and if I'm like, what's this word in French? I can go type it in. I wish you could like take
Yeah.
a paper and be like, can you translate this into everyday
Yeah.
English for me, and make it easier without the interpretation of like a pop journalist that's not very
Yeah.
good at reading the science.
No, that's right. The answer is 42, just
Right.
yeah.
Always make sure you have a pillow with you. Or is it, no, it's a towel. Don't forget to bring a
The
towel.
town, yeah, that's right.
Pillow. I, pillows in my head. Towel. There's a
Yeah.
towel. Um, so we're coming up here on the end of our time. To be mindful
Sure.
of your time. So I asked everybody this season. I don't know if you watched Matt's episode a couple weeks ago, but I asked everybody for this year if you can only choose one food for recovery, what food do you choose?
My honest answer, and it's not a good answer, my honest answer would be a nice cold beer.
Okay.
But that's not from any kind of physiological viewpoint at all,
Right.
apart from the rehydration, which is quite useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, for one food for recovery, I mean, if we go by what we should be doing, then after like a hard workout, I guess that's what you're talking about here,
Yep.
is like
Yep.
post exercise, yeah, is a mix of some carbohydrate and some protein
Mm.
to replenish our glycogen store and to help support muscle protein synthesis. How you do that, there's a million different ways.
Yeah.
You can reach for a bottle of energy powder. You can reach for a nice like cooked meal that happens to be in the fridge. Me personally, I quite like just to eat some bread and some cheese and a bit of like tuna or something like this. But it's just whatever you've got on the shelf, and
Yeah.
So I don't advocate superfoods. I don't really believe there's such a thing as a superfood for recovery after exercise.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no one nutrient that's going to optimize our adaptation or resynthesize what we've depleted during the exercise. So yeah, so I'd be hesitant to pick out one single food. But,
No, that's okay. The reason I love this question is I think I mean, food's universal. We all have to eat, but
yeah,
it kind of forces you to be able to pick something. And what I noticed, kind of like you did, is that a lot of people will say, like, I've gotten pizza several times and just
yeah,
tacos. Every once in a while, I'll get something that usually from the like dietitians or more like nutrition focused career people.
mm,
Something that is what you would anticipate as like the quote unquote healthy answer.
mm,
Um, but it seems like regardless of performance level, people have
yeah,
almost like a comfort food that they're
yeah.
like I need this, and it's maybe it's not a case of I just need the physiological side of it, but like I need a mental reprieve, so like I need almost like a treat.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's funny actually that there was something we used to call it Dirty Sunday, and in Cleveland after our long runs, we would go and eat some obscene like fast food wherever it
Uh
was from, Arby's, McDonald's, or whatever. It's like the milestone of nutrition after a long effort. But
Yeah.
yeah, so but I think one of the interesting things with that is that it's what you have access to, and we can, as scientists, nutritionists, whatever, you can preach what people should be doing, but the
Mm,
reality is what people actually do can be quite different.
right.
And it's often related to what you have access to, and it's happened to me 1,000 times, and it happens to people I coach. Is you come back from a ridiculous workout and your fridge is empty,
Hmm.
and you're like, okay, so what do I do? Like, I need to hobble down to the store and buy some groceries, or you can get Just Eat open on your app and get something delivered. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I'd be lying if I said I hadn't like fast food delivered a kebab from Just Eat after a workout because I had nothing in the house. But
No, that's okay. I love seeing like the reality of it because we all have that idea about, like you said, okay, like that the proteins and carbs often prescribed in the 4-to-1 ratio, and okay, I need to just have all this perfect timing and all this kind of things, but it's like life is messier than that. So I love seeing how it actually works out for most people.
yeah, yeah, nice.
So.
Yeah.
Thomas, if people want to get in touch with you, kind of see what you're doing, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I think in the context of this discussion, the website vo2.com, veohtu.com, you can
And
check
that's up
out.
on the screen if you're up on YouTube.
Yes, excellent. So yeah, you can connect there, and you can find the social media channels through there at vo2, and that's the best way to get a hold of me. So yeah,
Sounds good. Thanks for coming on today, Thomas.
thank you very much. Pleasure. Thanks for thanks for asking me some nice questions.
Cheers.
Cheers.